The ancient castle of Ravenshollow stood majestically against the evening sky, its stone walls holding centuries of secrets within their weathered embrace. Lady Victoria Ashford hurried through the dimly lit corridors, her silk slippers making barely a whisper against the cold marble floors. In her trembling hands, she clutched a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, each one containing words that could destroy the very foundation of the royal household she had served faithfully for over 2 decades. Victoria had discovered the letters purely by accident while organizing the late Queen Mother's private chambers. Hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace mantel, these correspondence pieces revealed a shocking truth about the royal lineage that had been carefully concealed for generations. The elegant handwriting belonged to Princess Isabella, the current king's sister, and they detailed a forbidden romance that had resulted in a secret marriage and child many years ago. As Victoria made her way toward her private quarters, her heart pounded with the weight of this discovery. She knew that revealing these letters would not only scandalize the kingdom but could potentially alter the line of succession itself. The recipients of these passionate love letters was none other than Duke Marcus Blackwood, a man who had been publicly declared an enemy of the crown and exiled from the kingdom 25 years prior. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor, causing Victoria to quickly duck behind a massive tapestry depicting ancient battle scenes. Through the heavy fabric, she could hear the familiar voices of Lord Edmund Sterling, the king's most trusted advisor, and Captain Harrison Wells, the head of the Royal Guard. Their conversation was hushed but urgent, and Victoria strained to listen to their words. "The situation has become more complicated than we anticipated," Lord Edmund was saying, his voice filled with concern. "There are rumors circulating among the court that certain historical documents have surfaced. Documents that could prove quite embarrassing to the royal family if they were to become public knowledge." Captain Wells responded with obvious frustration in his tone. "My men have been conducting discreet searches throughout the castle for weeks now. If such documents exist, they have been hidden with extraordinary care. However, I must ask you directly, Lord Edmund, do you have any specific knowledge of what we are searching for?" There was a long pause before Lord Edmund answered, and Victoria could almost feel the tension in the air. "Letters, Captain. Love letters written by Princess Isabella during her youth. Letters that reveal relationships and decisions that were meant to remain buried forever. If these letters were to fall into the wrong hands, they could be used to question the legitimacy of our current royal line." Victoria pressed herself further against the wall, her breath caught in her throat. These men were searching for the very letters she now possessed. The bundle in her hands seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment as she realized the magnitude of her discovery. She had stumbled upon the exact documents that the kingdom's most powerful men were desperately trying to find and, presumably, destroy. "What makes you believe these letters still exist?" Captain Wells inquired, his military training evident in his direct questioning style. Surely Princess Isabella would have had the foresight to destroy such compromising correspondence before her death. Lord Edmund sighed deeply before responding. "Because, my dear Captain, Princess Isabella was a romantic at heart, despite her royal obligations. She kept everything that reminded her of her lost love, including letters, gifts, and even a secret diary. Our intelligence suggests that she hid these items somewhere within the castle walls before her arranged marriage to Prince Ferdinand of neighboring Astoria." The two men continued their conversation as they walked further down the corridor, their voices gradually fading into the distance. Victoria waited several more minutes before emerging from her hiding spot, her mind racing with the implications of what she had overheard. She now understood that she was not the only one who knew about these letters, and that there were powerful forces actively working to ensure they never saw the light of day. Returning to her chambers, Victoria carefully locked the door behind her and drew the heavy curtains closed. By the flickering light of several candles, she sat at her small writing desk and began to examine the letters more closely. The first letter was dated nearly 30 years ago, written in Princess Isabella's distinctive flowing script. As Victoria read the passionate words of love and longing, she began to piece together a story that was far more complex and heartbreaking than she had initially realized. Princess Isabella had indeed fallen deeply in love with Duke Marcus Blackwood, but their romance was doomed from the beginning due to political tensions between their families. The letters revealed that Isabella had secretly married Marcus in a private ceremony officiated by a sympathetic priest, and that she had given birth to his child, a son who was quietly sent away to be raised by trusted friends in a distant province. The political implications of this revelation were staggering. If Princess Isabella had been legally married to Duke Marcus at the time of her arranged marriage to Prince Ferdinand, then, her subsequent marriage would have been invalid. More importantly, her secret son with Duke Marcus would have a legitimate claim to the throne, potentially superseding the current king's right to rule. Victoria realized that she was now in possession of information that could topple the government and throw the entire kingdom into chaos. The weight of this responsibility was almost unbearable, yet she also felt a strange sense of duty to the memory of Princess Isabella, who had clearly suffered greatly from being forced to abandon her true love and give up her child. As the night wore on, Victoria found herself torn between her loyalty to the royal family she had served faithfully and her growing conviction that the truth deserved to be known. She thought about Princess Isabella's son, now a grown man who had been living his entire life unaware of his true parentage and royal heritage. Did he not deserve to know the truth about his identity? The sound of rain beginning to fall against her window brought Victoria back to the present moment. She carefully retied the ribbon around the letters and considered her options. She could burn the letters and pretend she had never found them, ensuring that the royal family's secrets remained buried forever. Alternatively, she could find a way to reveal the truth, knowing that doing so would likely result in her own exile or worse. As dawn approached, Victoria made a decision that would change the course of history. She would not burn the letters, but neither would she reveal them immediately. Instead, she would seek out Princess Isabella's lost son and give him the choice of what to do with his mother's secret correspondence. It seemed like the only fair solution to an impossible situation. Victoria spent the early morning hours developing a plan to locate Princess Isabella's son without arousing suspicion from Lord Edmund or Captain Wells. She knew that her every movement would likely be watched now that rumors of the letter's existence had begun to circulate. However, her decades of service in the castle had taught her how to navigate the complex web of servants, guards, and courtiers without drawing unwanted attention. 3 weeks had passed since Victoria's discovery, and her careful investigation had finally yielded results. Through discreet conversations with elderly servants and a thorough examination of church records from neighboring provinces, she had managed to trace Princess Isabella's son to a small village called Millbrook, located approximately 2 days' journey from the castle. The young man, now 28 years old, was known in the village as Thomas Whitmore, a respected blacksmith who was beloved by the local community for his skill and generous nature. Victoria had managed to arrange for a leave of absence from her duties, claiming that she needed to visit her ailing sister in the countryside. This excuse would provide her with the perfect cover for traveling to Millbrook without raising suspicions. However, as she prepared for her journey, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched more closely than usual. Her suspicions were confirmed when she noticed Captain Wells posting additional guards at various entrances to the castle, ostensibly for routine security purposes. Moreover, Lord Edmund had been making more frequent appearances in the servants' quarters, engaging in seemingly casual conversations that Victoria recognized as subtle interrogations designed to uncover any unusual activity or knowledge among the staff. The night before her planned departure, Victoria was awakened by strange sounds coming from the corridor outside her room. Peering carefully through a crack in her door, she observed 2 figures dressed in dark clothing moving stealthily through the servants' wing of the castle. One of the figures was clearly Captain Wells, but the other person's identity was obscured by shadows and a heavy hooded cloak. Victoria watched as the mysterious pair stopped at each door along the corridor, apparently listening for any signs of activity within the rooms. When they reached her door, Victoria held her breath and remained perfectly still, hoping that they would assume she was sleeping soundly. After what felt like an eternity, the figures moved on, continuing their clandestine patrol through the castle's servant quarters. The next morning, Victoria learned from other servants that several rooms had been searched during the night, though nothing appeared to have been taken. The official explanation provided by Captain Wells was that the searches were part of a routine security inspection designed to ensure that no contraband items were being stored in the servant quarters. However, Victoria understood that this was clearly a targeted search for the missing letters. Despite the increased scrutiny, Victoria proceeded with her planned journey to Millbrook. She departed the castle before dawn, traveling in a simple horse-drawn cart that would help her blend in with other common travelers on the road.
The letters remained safely hidden in a specially designed compartment sewn into her traveling cloak, a precaution she had taken in case her belongings were searched at any point during her journey.
The road to Millbrook wound through beautiful countryside filled with rolling hills, dense forests, and picturesque farming communities. Victoria had rarely traveled beyond the castle grounds during her years of service, and she found herself both nervous and excited about this adventure. However, her apprehension grew when she noticed that another traveler seemed to be following the same route at a discreet distance behind her. The mysterious follower maintained a careful gap between their horses, never getting close enough for Victoria to identify them clearly, but never falling so far behind as to lose sight of her cart. Victoria's driver, an elderly man named Samuel who had served the castle for many years, also noticed their persistent companion and began taking alternate routes through smaller villages in an attempt to determine whether they were truly being followed. By the afternoon of the first day, it became clear that someone was indeed tracking their movements. Samuel suggested that they stop for the night at a busy inn where they would be surrounded by other travelers, making it more difficult for their pursuer to approach them without being observed. Victoria agreed to this plan, though she spent a restless night worrying about the safety of the letters and the potential consequences of her mission.
The second day of travel brought new challenges when Samuel discovered that one of their cartwheels had been deliberately damaged during the night.
The sabotage was subtle but effective, designed to slow their progress rather than stop them completely.
This confirmed Victoria's fears that whoever was following them had hostile intentions and was actively working to prevent her from reaching her destination.
Despite the damaged wheel, Samuel managed to coax their cart into the village of Millbrook by late afternoon. The village was exactly as Victoria had imagined it, a peaceful community of stone cottages surrounded by well-tended gardens and workshops. The sound of hammers striking metal led them directly to Thomas Whitmore's blacksmith shop, located at the heart of the village near the main square.
Victoria's first glimpse of Thomas Whitmore took her breath away.
The young man possessed the same distinctive features that she remembered from portraits of Princess Isabella in her youth: piercing blue eyes, dark hair with a natural wave, and an elegant bearing that seemed out of place in his humble surroundings. More striking still was his resemblance to Duke Marcus Blackwood, whose portrait still hung in one of the castle's forgotten corridors. Thomas was working at his forge when Victoria and Samuel arrived, his powerful arms shaping red-hot metal with practiced precision. Several village children were gathered around his workshop, watching with fascination as he crafted what appeared to be decorative ironwork for the local church. His patience with the children and his obvious skill at his craft immediately endeared him to Victoria, who could see why the villagers held him in such high regard. When Thomas noticed his visitors, he set down his hammer and approached them with a friendly smile.
"Good afternoon, travelers. I'm Thomas Whitmore. How can I be of service to you?"
His voice was warm and educated, with just a hint of the refined accent that Victoria associated with noble birth. Victoria felt her heart racing as she prepared to deliver the news that would change this young man's life forever.
"Mr. Whitmore, my name is Victoria Ashford.
I have traveled from Ravenshollow Castle because I have information about your family history that I believe you deserve to know." The smile on Thomas's face faded slightly, replaced by a look of curiosity mixed with caution.
"My family history? I'm afraid there isn't much to tell, Miss Ashford.
I was orphaned as an infant and raised by the village priest and his sister. They told me that my parents died in a plague that swept through the region when I was very young." Victoria glanced around the village square, noting that their conversation was attracting attention from several curious onlookers.
"Mr. Whitmore, what I have to share with you is quite sensitive. Is there somewhere private where we might speak?" Thomas nodded and gestured toward a small cottage adjacent to his workshop. "That's my home. We can talk there without interruption."
He turned to address the children who had been watching him work.
"That's enough for today, young ones. The forge needs to cool down before tomorrow's work begins."
As they walked toward Thomas's cottage, Victoria noticed movement in the shadows near the village inn. Their mysterious follower had apparently arrived in Millbrook and was attempting to observe their meeting from a distance. Victoria made a mental note to be extremely careful about how much information she revealed and to ensure that the precious letters remained hidden until she could be certain of Thomas's reaction to her news. Inside the modest but comfortable cottage, Thomas offered Victoria and Samuel refreshments while they settled into chairs near the fireplace. The interior of the home reflected its owner's character: simple but well-made furniture, carefully maintained tools, and several books that suggested an educated mind despite his humble circumstances.
"Now then, Miss Ashford," Thomas said as he served tea in simple pottery cups, "what is this information about my family that has brought you all this way from the royal castle?"
Part 3. Victoria took a deep breath, knowing that the words she was about to speak would irrevocably change Thomas Whitmore's understanding of his own identity. She had rehearsed this moment during her journey, but, now that she faced him directly, the magnitude of her revelation felt overwhelming. "Thomas," she began carefully, "what I'm about to tell you may be difficult to believe, and it will certainly be difficult to accept. The story you've been told about your parents and your origins is not the complete truth." She paused, watching his face for any sign of alarm or distrust. Thomas leaned forward in his chair, his blue eyes focused intently on Victoria's face. "Please, continue. I've always felt that there were gaps in the story of my childhood. The priest and his sister were kind to me, but they were always vague when I asked specific questions about my parents." Victoria reached into her traveling cloak and carefully withdrew the bundle of letters, placing them on the small table between them. "These letters were written by your mother, Thomas. Her name was Princess Isabella, and she was the sister of the current king." The color drained from Thomas's face as he stared at the letters. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You're suggesting that I'm of royal blood?" "More than that," Victoria replied gently. "According to these letters, your parents were secretly married before Princess Isabella was forced into an arranged marriage with Prince Ferdinand. If this is true, then you are not only of royal blood, but you may have a legitimate claim to the throne itself." Thomas stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the village square where he had lived his entire adult life. "This is madness," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'm a blacksmith. I make horseshoes and farming tools. I know nothing about royal courts or politics or—" "Your father was Duke Marcus Blackwood," Victoria continued, knowing that she needed to share all the information while she had the courage to do so. "He was exiled from the kingdom because of his relationship with your mother, but these letters prove that their love was genuine and that their marriage was legitimate." Thomas turned back to face Victoria, his eyes now blazing with a mixture of anger and confusion. "If what you're saying is true, then why was I abandoned? Why was I left to grow up believing I was an orphan while my mother lived in luxury at the royal court?" Victoria's heart ached for the pain she could see in Thomas's eyes. "Because, Thomas, she had no choice. The political situation at the time made it impossible for her to acknowledge your existence without starting a war between noble families. She gave you up to protect you, not because she didn't love you." Samuel, who had been sitting quietly throughout this exchange, suddenly stood and moved to the window. "Miss Victoria," he said urgently, "we have company." There are several armed men surrounding the cottage. Victoria joined Samuel at the window and immediately recognized Captain Wells among the group of men positioning themselves around Thomas's home. Her worst fears were being realized. They had been followed, and now the royal guard had come to reclaim the letters and silence anyone who knew about their contents. "Thomas," Victoria said urgently, "you need to decide right now what you want to do with this information. Those men outside are here to take these letters and ensure that no one ever learns the truth about your parentage." Thomas grabbed the bundle of letters and held them against his chest. "These are from my mother? These actually contain her words, her thoughts about me?" "Yes," Victoria replied. "And if you read them, you'll understand how much she loved you and how deeply she regretted having to give you up." A loud knock on the cottage door interrupted their conversation. "Open in the name of the king," Captain Wells's authoritative voice commanded from outside. Thomas looked at Victoria with determination replacing the confusion in his eyes. "What do you think I should do?" Victoria realized that this was the moment she had been preparing for since discovering the letters. "That choice is yours to make, Thomas. You can surrender the letters and return to your life as a blacksmith, or you can fight for your right to know the truth about your heritage." The knocking on the door became more insistent, accompanied by Captain Wells's voice again. "We know you're in there, Miss Ashford. Surrender the stolen documents and come out peacefully." Thomas moved swiftly to a loose floorboard near his fireplace and pried it up, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. "I've been hiding things since I was a child," he explained as he carefully placed the letters inside the secret space. "If these letters are truly from my mother, then I need time to read them properly before anyone else gets their hands on them." "Thomas Whitmore," Captain Wells called out, having apparently learned the blacksmith's name from villagers, "you are harboring a fugitive and stolen royal property. Open this door immediately or we will break it down." Victoria felt a surge of admiration for Thomas's courage and quick thinking. "There's a back entrance to your cottage," she observed. "If we can slip out quietly, we might be able to lose them in the forest behind the village." "No," Thomas said firmly. "This is my home, my village. I won't run from these men until I understand exactly what they want and why they're so desperate to destroy evidence of my mother's life." The cottage door suddenly burst open as Captain Wells and two of his guards forced their way inside. The captain's eyes immediately focused on Victoria, his expression showing both relief at finding her and anger at the trouble she had caused. "Miss Ashford," Captain Wells said with cold formality, "you are under arrest for theft of royal property and treason against the crown. Surrender the documents you stole from the castle immediately." Victoria stood as straight and dignified as possible despite her fear. "Captain Wells, I have stolen nothing. I discovered those letters while performing my assigned duties, and I have every right to ensure they are treated with the respect they deserve." "Those letters belong to the royal family," Captain Wells replied. "They are private correspondence that was never meant to be seen by unauthorized individuals." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between Victoria and the guards. "Captain, I believe there may be some confusion here. Miss Ashford has been visiting me to discuss genealogical research. There are no stolen documents in this cottage." Captain Wells studied Thomas's face carefully, and Victoria could see recognition dawning in the captain's eyes. The family resemblance between Thomas and the royal line was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. "Mr. Whitmore," Captain Wells said slowly, "I think it would be in everyone's best interests if you accompanied us back to Ravenshollow Castle. There are certain matters that require clarification, and your cooperation would be greatly appreciated." "Are you arresting me, Captain?" Thomas asked directly. "That depends entirely on your willingness to cooperate with our investigation," Captain Wells replied diplomatically. Victoria realized that Captain Wells was in a difficult position. He couldn't arrest Thomas without cause, but he also couldn't allow the potential heir to remain free with knowledge of his true identity. The captain was clearly trying to find a solution that would satisfy his orders while avoiding an incident that might create more problems for the royal family. "I'll come with you willingly," Thomas said after a moment of consideration, "but only if Miss Ashford is treated as a guest rather than a prisoner. She has done nothing wrong except share historical information with me." Captain Wells considered this proposal carefully. "Very well, Mr. Whitmore. Miss Ashford will be our guest, and you will be our consultant on matters of genealogical significance." As they prepared to leave the cottage, Thomas managed to whisper to Victoria, "The letters are safe. Whatever happens at the castle, they won't be able to destroy the truth about my mother's life." Victoria nodded, understanding that Thomas had made his choice. He would face whatever consequences awaited them at Ravenshollow Castle, but he would do so with the knowledge of his true heritage and the security of knowing that his mother's words were preserved. Part for the journey back to Ravenshollow Castle took on a completely different character than Victoria's hopeful trip to Millbrook. She and Thomas traveled in a heavily guarded carriage, while Captain Wells rode alongside on horseback, his expression grim and thoughtful. The captain seemed to be wrestling with the implications of Thomas's resemblance to the royal family, and Victoria could sense that he was beginning to understand the true magnitude of the situation. During the long hours of travel, Victoria and Thomas spoke in hushed tones about the contents of Princess Isabella's letters. Thomas had managed to read several of them before their departure, and his emotional response to his mother's words was both heartbreaking and inspiring to witness. The letters revealed a young woman torn between duty and love, who had sacrificed her own happiness to prevent a political crisis that could have torn the kingdom apart. "She wrote about me," Thomas whispered to Victoria as they watched the countryside pass by outside the carriage window. "She described holding me as a baby and singing lullabies that her own mother had sung to her. She even wrote down the names she had chosen for me, Thomas after her grandfather, and Marcus after my father. Victoria felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to Thomas process this information.
She never forgot you, Thomas.
Even in her letters to Duke Marcus, she mentioned you constantly. She called you her greatest joy and her deepest sorrow.
What happened to my father? Thomas asked.
The letters mention his exile, but they don't explain what became of him afterward. According to the letters, Duke Marcus settled in the neighboring kingdom of Valdoria, where he established a successful trading business, Victoria replied. Princess Isabella continued to correspond with him secretly for several years after your birth, but, eventually, the risk became too great.
The last letter in the collection was written nearly 20 years ago.
Captain Wells occasionally glanced back at his passengers, clearly trying to overhear their conversation without appearing too obvious about his eavesdropping. Victoria noticed that the captain's stern demeanor had begun to soften somewhat as they traveled, perhaps indicating that he was developing sympathy for Thomas's situation. As they approached the outer walls of Raven's Hollow Castle, Thomas gazed up at the imposing structure with a mixture of awe and trepidation. I never imagined I would see this place, he admitted to Victoria. When I was a child, I used to dream about visiting the royal castle, but I never thought it would happen under circumstances like these. The carriage passed through the massive gates and into the castle courtyard, where a small crowd of servants and courtiers had gathered to observe the arrival of the mysterious visitors. Victoria could see curiosity and speculation in their faces as they tried to understand why the head of the royal guard had personally escorted a common blacksmith to the castle. Lord Edmund Stirling was waiting for them at the entrance to the main hall, his sophisticated appearance contrasting sharply with Thomas's simple traveling clothes. However, Victoria noticed that Lord Edmund's confident expression faltered slightly when he got his first clear look at Thomas's face.
Captain Wells, Lord Edmund said with forced casualness, I trust your mission was successful?
Partially, my lord, Captain Wells replied diplomatically. Miss Ashford and Mr. Whitmore have agreed to assist us with our genealogical research project. Lord Edmund's eyes narrowed slightly at this euphemistic description of their situation.
Excellent.
I'm sure they'll find our library facilities quite adequate for their research needs. Thomas was clearly intimidated by the grandeur of his surroundings, but Victoria was impressed by how quickly he adapted to the formal atmosphere of the royal court. His natural dignity and intelligence helped him navigate the complex social dynamics, even though he lacked experience with aristocratic customs and protocols. They were escorted to a suite of rooms in the castle's guest wing, which Victoria realized was both an honor and a form of house arrest. The rooms were luxuriously appointed but clearly guarded, with Captain Wells posting men at strategic locations throughout the corridor. You'll be comfortable here while we conduct our research, Lord Edmund informed them. Of course, for security reasons, you'll need to remain within this wing of the castle unless specifically escorted elsewhere. That evening, Victoria and Thomas were invited to dine with Lord Edmund in a private dining room. The meal was an elegant affair, served on fine china with crystal glasses and silver cutlery. Thomas handled himself admirably despite his unfamiliarity with formal dining etiquette, and Victoria could see that Lord Edmund was carefully observing every aspect of the young man's behavior.
Mr. Whitmore, Lord Edmund said during the main course, Miss Ashford tells us that you're interested in genealogical research. Have you discovered anything particularly interesting about your family history? Thomas met Lord Edmund's gaze directly.
I've recently learned that my parents may not have been the simple farmers I was told they were. It appears that my true heritage is somewhat more complicated than I originally understood.
Indeed?
Lord Edmund replied with carefully controlled interest.
And what evidence do you have to support these new theories about your parentage?
Letters, Thomas said simply. Personal correspondence that provides detailed information about my birth and the circumstances surrounding my early childhood.
Victoria could see the tension in Lord Edmund's posture as he processed this confirmation of his worst fears.
The letters not only existed but had been read by their intended beneficiary.
These letters, Lord Edmund continued, would they happen to be the historical documents that have gone missing from our archives?
I wouldn't know about your archives, my lord, Thomas replied diplomatically. But I can tell you that the letters I've seen were never intended to be public documents.
They were private correspondence between family members. After dinner, Victoria and Thomas were escorted back to their rooms with the understanding that they would meet with Lord Edmund again the following morning to discuss their research findings in greater detail. Once they were alone, Victoria realized that Thomas had handled the evening's interrogation with remarkable skill for someone who had no experience with court politics. "You did well tonight," Victoria told him as they sat in the comfortable sitting room that connected their bedchambers. "Lord Edmund was clearly trying to determine how much you know and what your intentions are regarding the information you've discovered." "What do you think will happen tomorrow?" Thomas asked. "I can see that these people are afraid of what the letters might reveal, but I don't understand why they consider my existence to be such a threat." Victoria sat forward in her chair, choosing her words carefully. "Thomas, if your parents were truly married before Princess Isabella's arranged marriage to Prince Ferdinand, then you have a legitimate claim to the royal throne. That claim could supersede the current king's right to rule." "But I don't want to be king," Thomas protested. "I'm happy with my life as a blacksmith. I have no interest in politics or ruling a kingdom." "Unfortunately," Victoria replied sadly, "what you want may not matter. The mere existence of your claim could be used by others to challenge the current government. Lord Edmund and Captain Wells aren't just concerned about you, they're worried about anyone who might use your heritage to justify rebellion or civil war." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fireplace as he processed the implications of Victoria's words. "So what are my options?" he finally asked. "That depends," Victoria said, "on whether you're willing to renounce any claim to the throne in exchange for being allowed to return to your normal life." "And if I refuse?" Victoria's expression grew grave. "Then, I'm afraid we may both find ourselves permanent residents of Ravenshollow Castle, for the safety and security of the kingdom." Part 5 the next morning brought an unexpected development that changed everything Victoria and Thomas thought they understood about their situation. They were awakened before dawn by urgent knocking on their door, followed by the entrance of Captain Wells accompanied by a figure Victoria had never expected to see, an elderly man wearing the simple robes of a village priest, but carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Thomas, my boy," the elderly man said with obvious emotion in his voice, "I've traveled all night to reach you." Thomas stared at the newcomer in amazement. "Father Benedict? What are you doing here? How did you even know where to find me?" The priest smiled sadly as he approached Thomas. "I've known this day would come eventually, though I hoped it might be many more years before we had to face it. Captain Wells contacted me yesterday to verify certain information about your childhood, and I realized that the time had finally come to tell you the complete truth about your origins." Victoria watched this reunion with growing confusion. "Thomas, who is this gentleman?" "Father Benedict raised me after my parents died," Thomas explained. "He and his sister took me in when I was just an infant." Father Benedict shook his head slowly. "That's not entirely accurate, Thomas. Your parents didn't die when you were an infant. I was entrusted with your care by your mother herself, Princess Isabella, when you were just 3 days old." The room fell silent as everyone processed this revelation. Captain Wells appeared as surprised as Victoria and Thomas by this confession. "You knew?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, you knew who I really was?" Father Benedict nodded gravely. "Princess Isabella came to me in secret, accompanied by only one trusted servant. She was desperate to protect you from the political turmoil that surrounded your birth. She begged me to raise you as my own nephew and never reveal your true identity unless your life was in danger." "But why didn't you tell me when I became an adult?" Thomas demanded, clearly struggling with feelings of betrayal and confusion. "Because," Father Benedict replied, "your mother made me swear a sacred oath that I would only reveal your heritage if you were ever directly threatened because of it. She believed that knowledge of your royal blood would put you in constant danger, and she wanted you to have the chance to live a normal, peaceful life." Captain Wells stepped forward, his expression showing a mixture of respect and suspicion. "Father Benedict, do you have any proof of these claims?" The elderly priest reached into his robes and withdrew a small leather pouch. From within it, he extracted a delicate gold locket and a rolled parchment sealed with wax.
Princess Isabella left these items with me as proof of Thomas's identity, should the need ever arise to establish his parentage. Victoria gasped as she recognized the royal seal on the parchment. That's the personal seal of Princess Isabella. I've seen it on official documents in the castle archives. Father Benedict handed the locket to Thomas, who opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a miniature portrait of a beautiful young woman with the same blue eyes and dark hair that Thomas possessed, alongside a tiny lock of baby's hair tied with a silk ribbon. She painted this herself, Father Benedict explained. She told me she wanted you to have something that would help you remember her face if you ever learned the truth about your heritage. Thomas stared at the portrait with tears in his eyes. She's beautiful, he whispered. I can see the resemblance, but I never would have imagined. Captain Wells examined the sealed document carefully. This appears to be authentic, but we'll need to have it verified by the royal archivists before we can accept it as legal proof of anything. There's more, Father Benedict continued. Princess Isabella didn't just leave you with me and disappear. She visited you secretly several times during your first year of life. She would travel to our village in disguise, spending hours holding you and singing the lullabies she mentioned in her letters. Victoria felt her heart breaking as she imagined the young princess torn between her royal duties and her love for her child. How often did she visit? Less frequently as you grew older, Father Benedict replied, addressing Thomas directly. The last time she came to see you, you were nearly 2 years old. She had just learned that her arranged marriage to Prince Ferdinand was being finalized, and she knew that visiting you would become impossible once she became a married woman with official obligations. Thomas closed the locket carefully and held it against his chest. Did she say anything about my father? Father Benedict's expression grew even more solemn. She spoke of Duke Marcus constantly. She told me that he had wanted to take you away from the kingdom entirely, to raise you in exile where you would be safe from political intrigue. But she refused to let you be taken so far away from her. What happened to change her mind about my safety? Thomas asked. Civil unrest, Captain Wells answered before Father Benedict could respond. There were rumors at the time that Duke Marcus's supporters were planning to use Princess Isabella's child as a rallying point for rebellion against the current king. The royal family decided that the child had to disappear completely to prevent a civil war. Victoria realized that they were finally hearing the complete story of Thomas's origins. So Princess Isabella agreed to give up her son to prevent bloodshed in the kingdom. It was the most difficult decision she ever made, Father Benedict confirmed. She told me that she would rather live with the pain of separation than risk having Thomas's blood on her hands if violence erupted because of his existence. Lord Edmund Stirling chose that moment to enter the room, accompanied by several castle guards. His expression was grave as he surveyed the assembled group. Gentlemen, ladies, I'm afraid this reunion must be postponed. We have received word that Duke Marcus Blackwood is approaching our borders with a significant armed force. Everyone in the room stared at Lord Edmund in shock. Thomas found his voice first. My father is alive? And he's coming here? Very much alive, and apparently very well informed about recent events, Lord Edmund replied. Our intelligence suggests that he learned about Miss Ashford's discovery of the letters and your subsequent journey to Millbrook. He appears to be under the impression that his son is being held against his will. Captain Wells immediately shifted into military mode. How large is his force, and how much time do we have? Approximately 200 mounted soldiers, and they should reach our outer defenses by tomorrow evening, Lord Edmund answered. Duke Marcus has sent a messenger ahead demanding the immediate release of his son and the return of Princess Isabella's personal correspondence. Victoria felt a chill of fear as she realized that their private family drama was about to become a military confrontation. Lord Edmund, surely there must be a way to resolve this peacefully? That depends entirely on what Mr. Whitmore chooses to do, Lord Edmund replied, turning to face Thomas directly. You now find yourself in the unique position of being able to prevent or precipitate a conflict that could affect the entire kingdom. Thomas stood slowly, the weight of his newfound responsibility evident in his posture. What exactly are you asking me to do? Renounce any claim to the royal throne, publicly acknowledge the legitimacy of the current king's rule, and convince your father to withdraw his forces, Lord Edmund stated clearly.
And, in return?
You'll be free to return to your life as a blacksmith, with a generous settlement to compensate you for the disruption this situation has caused. The letters will be returned to the royal archives where they belong, and this entire matter will be forgotten.
Thomas looked around the room at the faces watching him: Victoria, who had risked everything to bring him the truth about his heritage; Father Benedict, who had protected him his entire life; Captain Wells, who was clearly torn between his duty and his growing respect for Thomas's character; and Lord Edmund, who represented the established order that Thomas's very existence threatened.
"I need time to consider this decision," Thomas said finally. "And I want to speak with my father before I make any commitments that will affect the rest of my life."
Lord Edmund nodded reluctantly.
"Very well.
You have until tomorrow evening to make your choice.
But I want you to understand, Mr. Whitmore, that the stability of our entire kingdom may depend on your decision." As the various officials departed to prepare for Duke Marcus's arrival, Victoria remained with Thomas and Father Benedict. The three of them sat in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the remarkable events that had brought them to this moment.
"What do you think my mother would want me to do?" Thomas asked Father Benedict.
The elderly priest considered this question carefully before responding. "I think Princess Isabella would want you to choose the path that brings the least suffering to the greatest number of people. She sacrificed her own happiness to prevent conflict in the kingdom.
The question you must ask yourself is whether you're prepared to make a similar sacrifice."
Thomas walked to the window and gazed out at the castle grounds, where soldiers were already beginning preparations for a potential siege.
"Victoria, do you regret bringing me the letters?"
Victoria joined him at the window.
"Never, Thomas.
You had a right to know the truth about your heritage. What you choose to do with that knowledge is entirely up to you, but I'm proud that I was able to give you the choice." As the sun set over Ravenshollow Castle, Thomas made his decision. Tomorrow, he would meet with his father for the first time in his adult life, and together they would determine the future not just of their own family, but potentially of the entire kingdom. Whatever the outcome, Thomas knew that he would face it with the knowledge that he was truly loved by both of his parents, and that their sacrifice had been made out of devotion rather than abandonment. The letters that had started this entire adventure remained safely hidden in his cottage in Millbrook, but their contents were now permanently inscribed in Thomas's heart, giving him the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead with courage and dignity worthy of his royal heritage.